And we're going to have a few stories now of courage and resilience. And did I mention this is going to be an interactive service a little bit? Okay? So, but before that part, I want to say, what is the story of Greenham Commons? What is the story of Greenham Commons, where that song came from? Well, it had been a traditional English commons for about 1,000 years, going back to the Norman invasion in 1066, right? And the commons had been used as a staging field for military operations during the English Civil Wars in the 1600s and things like that. But in 1941, during World War II, the British Air Ministry, why do they call those ministries, right? The British Air Ministry requisitioned the estate house, which is right in the middle of the Commons, for use by the Air Force, and including the US Air Force. And in 1943, it was actually turned over to the US Air Force, and it served as one of the airfields in England that was used in the Allied defense during World War II. So after the war ended, it didn't go back to being a grazing commons, though, because it had all this infrastructure on it, and it continued to be used for military purposes, including the stockpiling of nuclear weapons. And that was going on, and finally it was announced that there were 96 cruise missiles with nuclear warheads coming to Greenham Commons, and a group of Welsh women who called themselves Women for Life on Earth walked from Cardiff to Greenham Common with the intention of challenging, by debate, the decision to site those things in that place. But of course their request was ignored, right? Because, why even bother responding? So what they did is they set up a peace encampment just outside the fence that surrounded the RAF, the Royal Air Force base there. And they sat down. And this occupation became known as the Greenham Commons Women's Peace Camp, and it lasted for 19 years.
Oh, wow.
As the US and the USSR continued to compete for nuclear superiority in Europe, the camp, which was committed to disrupting the exercises of the US Air Force peaceably, was highly effective in drawing international attention to this. And the women of the camp were committed to nonviolence and non-alignment. They weren't aligning with anybody. The camp conditions were primitive. There was no water, no electricity, right? No telephone. And the women were routinely evicted, and just as they just as routinely came back to reoccupy the site. So evict, come back, evict, come back. And that just kept happening. They were also subject to attacks by local vigilantes who really didn't want them around, right? They wanted their own place back. Well, despite all this, the women from the United Kingdom and other parts of Europe and the world started coming in to this peace encampment as these protests continued, and they were sort of masterful at this. They did their protests using theater and song and actions of various sorts, peaceful actions, and they got quite a lot of publicity, and people kept coming and coming and coming, and they chained themselves to the fences, and they were removed from the fences and taken to jail, and they came back, and they kept, this kept happening. And because it was a group of humans, there were inevitably a lot of disagreements about how to proceed, right? Because that's how humans are put together. And so there was a lot of creative process to resolve those camp tensions, camps sprung up at 9 different gates of this compound. They had different flavors, shall we say. One was religious, one did not welcome men even as visitors, you know, so on and so forth. In December 1982, 30,000 women came to embrace the base and held hands around the Air Force Base. This was in response to the 3rd anniversary of NATO's decision to house nuclear missiles on British soil. A few weeks later, a small group of activists from the Commons, they bridged the fence. And why did they bridge the fence? They bridged the fence to dance on the missile silos. That was their action. We're gonna, if I can't dance, right, I don't want to be part of this revolution. A few months later, 70,000 protesters held hands and made a human chain from Greenham Commons to the ordnance factory at Burfield. Later, at the end of the year, 50,000 women congregated at Greenham for another encircling of the camp. And as the years rolled on, the Greenham women just kept doing this and kept attracting more and more attention. They drew heavily on their identity of women as mothers who were worried about their children and what would happen to children in the event of a nuclear disaster. They often dressed as black and they were keening. They would keen loudly together in preemptive memory of the children that could be lost to such an event. They published newsletters and they circulated songs. And finally, in 1991, 9 years after the start, the last missiles left the base. Mm-hmm. But the occupation remained in place because now they were talking about the United Kingdom's Trident program. Also, the women wanted to make a commemorative memorial. And so, when in 2000 they won the right to do that, to emplace a memorial, the last women left the camp. 19 years. The commemorative site opened in 2002, so it's open to the public. Now, there's several lessons that we can learn from this story. One thing to notice is that it's not the story of one hero, right? There's no 1 or 6 or 15 names. There are names, but there's no one name. Rather, it's a story of collective resistance, a story, if you will, of many stories that happened at the Commons in that time. And that's why they sang, building bridges across our divisions. I reach out to you, you reach out to me. The vision, we could build such a sweet harmony, right? Life was hard, and yet they found a way to re-story Greenham Commons from what it was to what it is today. The occupation was a community of communities, not one monolithic community. It wasn't the Greenham Women's Peace Commons. It was the Greenham Women's Peace Commons, plural. So with that in mind, I mean, that's just one story, and we all have stories that have inspired us. Maybe stories that we've heard from our family, maybe stories from elsewhere, like this one is not one of my family stories. Perhaps there's stories you've been exposed to that gave you that kind of courage and that kind of resilience. So I invite you now to take a moment in silence to think of a story of courage or resilience that is true in your life, that touched you, that helped you, that made it possible for you to persist in difficult times. I'll give you a couple minutes while you think about that story. Think about how to tell it very succinctly. And I'll ring the bell to bring you back. Now, I invite you to turn to a neighbor, ideally one that you did not arrive with, and succinctly share your story. And if you don't want to share, if you don't want to listen, that's fine. That's fine. Just please fold your hands and stay in silence. That'll be fine.
I came with you, so I can't talk to you. Do you have a story? I was trying to think of what I would Yeah. Yes. Yes. They put
So what we're doing right now is sharing the story that we came up with someone else in the room, the story of courage and of resilience that inspired you. A story that inspired you. And there's no right way to do this. There's no one right way to do this.
Yeah. Oh, really? Yeah. 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 And do you feel it? Do you feel it yourself responding? Oh, nice. Nice. We have to dig back on. Okay. Come on, go back. Huh? Interesting, wonderful stories. Wonderful stories, isn't it?
Thank you. There's much, much more to say, and I hope the conversations will continue over coffee and as you socialize together in the rest of your life. Share these stories with each other. It's good. It's good to share these stories. And now another one. This one is, for me, it's a thing I witnessed. The man named Kuyax paused for a minute before he addressed the crowd at the Anchorage Convention facility. An apparently westernized Unangam man, which is to say an Aleut man from the Pribilof Islands, he has deep traditional roots in his island community on St. Paul. And as he began his remarks, he confessed to feeling so many different things about agreeing to talk to this mostly Western audience about the effects of climate change on his community out on the far islands, the Pribilof Islands. So as he was agonizing about what to do and how to explain all this and what approach to take, he did what he'd been taught to do when he was faced with difficult problems like this. He asked the elders. And some days later, the message that they gave him to deliver was simple. They told him, and he told us that they told him, seek not to conquer evil. Let goodness take its place. Now, this teaching did not mean abandon activism in favor of thinking good thoughts. That's not what it means at all. Although it can be heard that way, right?
Oh.
But the message was to stop solidifying evil by resisting it, but instead to commit to life-affirming actions that will contribute positively and strategically to sustaining the web of life. Resisting, countering oppression like this is actually futile, because this kind of resistance privileges that which we resist. Or as the prophet and poet Audre Lorde put it in 1979, the master's tools will never, never dismantle the master's house. Instead, and this is a musical analogy, but if you watch my hands, I think you can understand what the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker taught. Instead of countering like this, we must amplify, and if this is the dominant life-crushing melody of our times, what we must do is to amplify the counterpoint melody, so that in time, the counterpoint melody becomes the dominant melody. This is a really important concept, because here's the thing, no one's ever gonna win. There is not an end to this story. It's an endless series of cycles, and no matter what we're doing, if we are not paying attention to amplifying the melody of the world that we envision before us together, if we are not doing that, we have stopped singing. And that melody, that beautiful counterpoint melody, or sometimes it's the dominant melody. You know, I mean, there are times when it's the dominant melody. But if we stop paying attention to it, it just kind of peters out. And something else takes its place and becomes the dominant melody. So, and this is the message I want to leave you with. We must focus on making new stories out of our lives, out of the fabric of our lives, to discover what resilience rather than simple resistance might look like. We must use all of our powers of creative imagination to envision that which we would build together. And then we have to work together across all of our divisions. All of our divisions, no this way, no that way, no this is better, that's better. Let's try both and see if maybe that works. All of that, so that we are working together across our differences, which are many, to amplify a counterpoint melody to a single theme that would have us deny all life. That's our job. The good news, although it's very hard work, is that it's soul satisfying. And don't expect to win, because that's a position of, huge privilege. If you give up because you haven't won, I think you're too used to winning. Because, who our leaders should be are people who are not used to winning, because they know they have to persist. And we have much to learn from people who have lost a lot. We should be listening to them very, very carefully. So finally, I'm just going to read one quote. I had a whole thing about Carolyn McDade, and how she came to write Spirit of Life, which is a great story, but what I want to do is I want to leave you with a quote from her. The profound energies that have formed galaxies and spread open the first pollen-hungry bud move within us. They have never once abandoned us, though we have abandoned ourselves and one another, and have most tragically, as humans, succeeded in cutting certain ones of us off from self-determination of our vital capacities, which is the spawning of oppression. But always there is that which whispers through the chains, there is more to life than this. It was never meant to stop here. So let us be in this together, friends. Let us commit to being together even when it's uncomfortable. Because being uncomfortable invites you into creative internal transformation, right? And if you don't stay long enough with your discomfort, then you don't get the lesson. And lessons will be repeated until learned, as we know. Right? I mean, it's cute, but it's true. We need each other, so let's stick together. And as we're sticking together in our messy humanness that we share, with the courage not to react, but to instead stay with things, with that in mind, let us now sing together number 1023 in the Teal hymnal, Building Bridges, a song that was created by the Greenham Women's Peace Camp. A few notes, just a note to open.
What's also on the screen?
On the screen.
It's on the screen, it's also 1023 in your book.
Building bridges between our divisions. I reach out to you, will you reach out be